Order, order. We start with questions to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 1.
Secretary of State, well.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it would not have escaped your notice that 4 years ago, on January the 11th, the Northern Ireland Assembly reformed, and on the 3rd of February 2022, resigned as the First Minister effectively collapsed the institution and power sharing by resigning at that point. Behind question 1, Mr. Speaker, alongside questions 5, 11 and 13, which, with your permission, I'd like to answer together, is a desire for power sharing and the Northern Ireland Executive to return, a desire that I very, very much share. Hence, Mr. Speaker, my last discussions with the leaders of most of the political parties took place in Hillsborough on Monday, where we discussed the very many matters related to this goal.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The negotiations with the DUP have been going on for quite some time now, but have not yet resulted in the restoration of the Executive. What does the Minister think the DUP are looking for?
I can actually, I can't answer for the party itself, and I would never do so. But behind all this was the concern over the Northern Ireland Protocol that came at the time as we left the European Union, about how goods were gradually being removed as a consequence of the protocol from shelves on the Northern Ireland supermarkets, as a visible sign that actually Northern Ireland was being pulled away from the sphere of the United Kingdom's influence into the European sphere. The Windsor Framework, I believe, set that straight.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the commitment to a £3.3 billion financial package from the Secretary of State. However, we are in a seemingly an impasse. The Secretary of State would be aware that there's a groundswell of opinion that believes elements of that package should be released to address the ongoing crisis in our public services and particular public sector pay pressures. Would he consider releasing some of that money to address particularly the public sector pay?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and indeed the way that he and his party have been conducting themselves in the talks that we have been having to try and get the Executive reformed. And the UK government did put an extremely fair and generous package on the table before Christmas, worth £3.3 billion for a reformed Executive. But the money that I have available and the Northern Ireland civil servants have available was the budget passed in this place in the last year.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was recently in County Kildare with the Minister, with the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, working to build understanding between the two countries. And we heard from both ministers in Ireland and from the ambassador the impact that the lack of an assembly, functioning assembly, is having. Bearing that in mind, and the struggles that we know people are having in Northern Ireland in terms of their bills, in terms of potential strike action, in terms of all kinds of issues, can the Minister just say a bit more about what actually he's doing in terms of the meetings he's having, the conversations he's having to work at pace to try and get a solution?
Yeah, and I thank the honourable lady for both her question, her interest, and the sentiment behind her question. And I mean, there's been a huge amount that has been going on, meetings galore with all the political parties in Northern Ireland, and especially the Democratic Unionist Party, because it is they that I need to get on board so the Executive can be restored. She mentions the phrase at pace, and we'll happily work at whatever pace we can, but it is slightly determined by our interlocutors in that space.
Thank you very much. There's current industrial action due to hard-pressed public servants feeling that they're at the end of their tether. Wouldn't it be better if the Assembly were functioning normally so that this could be resolved ASAP?
Yeah, and I thank the honourable lady for her question, because she is exactly right. The package that is on the table is a fair and generous package for a reformed Assembly. It is £3.3 million, as stated earlier, for a reformed Executive to use for this purpose and many others, because there are, as I think everybody involved in Northern Ireland politics understands, there is the need for transformation of public services in Northern Ireland, and this package helps do that too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend my right honourable friend on his efforts to try
and bring the Assembly and Executive back to Northern Ireland with what is a big offer. It's right, isn't it, that where direct rule is contemplated, we now would need primary legislation since the St Andrews Agreement. And the political reality is that that would mean a huge political pressure on all of us here, not just from within our United Kingdom, but from outside as well. Does he agree with me that the best way that we can preserve our great United Kingdom is for everybody to get back round the table and to govern Northern Ireland from Stormont?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question and welcome his election to be chair of the Northern Ireland Select Committee. Probably more than some other members in this place welcome him. I look to one certain one on the benches opposite. And he's absolutely right. And many a time, I mean, there is no way this government wants to go down the route of direct rule, which would need primary legislation. We do not want to go down the route of joint authority either. We will not go down that route. So what we do need to find is an appropriate form to allow the executive to reform, and that is what we're working unbelievably hard on with our colleagues in Northern Ireland.
Shailesh Vara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it is deeply regrettable that the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, is pampering more to his domestic audience rather than thinking of the greater good of Northern Ireland and the victims of the Troubles?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend actually makes a very, very fair point, because in the midst of all what we're trying to do to get the executive back up and running, the Republic of Ireland's decision to take an interstate case out against the UK government on our Legacy Act, which is designed to bring justice and information recovery to victims of the Troubles, is unhelpful and unfortunate, and we've made our representations very plain on that matter.
So, Secretary of State Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Now that the talks have concluded, the House voted overwhelmingly to support the Windsor Framework back in March. And on this side, we stand by our commitment to implement it if we were to be in government, and we support the efforts the government is making to restore the institutions. Furthermore, it's worth pointing out there would be no prospect of negotiating with the EU further arrangements of benefit to Northern Ireland if the UK were to renege again on an international agreement is signed. If the executive is not restored by tomorrow evening, can the Secretary of State just confirm that he will need to bring forward legislation to postpone the elections?
I thank my right honourable friend for his question, and thank him for his affirmation of the work done in the Windsor Framework space. And I obviously will be doing everything I possibly can personally to make sure that it's not a Labour government that might come in to do any of this in the future. But he is absolutely right. As of midnight on Thursday, tomorrow night, I will need to bring in primary legislation because a duty does fall on me to call an election for the Northern Ireland Assembly. I have a number of weeks, I think 12 weeks in which to do that. I intend to bring in legislation on these matters next week.
Hilary Benn.
Well, I'm grateful for that clarification. The absence of the executive and the failure to sort out the urgent question of public sector pay is going to result in the biggest strike in Northern Ireland for many years tomorrow. Some workers have not had a pay rise for almost 3 years. That is not sustainable. As we await the restoration of the institutions, the party leaders and indeed the head of the civil service in Northern Ireland have all called on the Secretary of State to release the money for pay which he has said is available. Will he now do so that those public sector pay workers in Northern Ireland can get the pay increase they deserve?
And I thank him for his question, and I am acutely aware of the industrial action and the detrimental impact this will have on public services that are scheduled for tomorrow. And I do hear the call from the honourable gentleman and others to step in. But if I may put this into a slightly different context, public sector pay is devolved to Northern Ireland. he will know that this Parliament, also, as I mentioned earlier, set the budget for Northern Ireland last year with primary legislation. He will also know that decisions on matters like this are obviously ones that locally elected ministers should take as they involve big and fundamental choices. Every penny spent on pay is a penny not spent on services. And choices around this are therefore eminently political. Indeed, as close as you would get to come to choices made in the period of direct rule. Direct rule is absolutely not the way forward here. These decisions are for the executive, and a restored executive has a generous financial package available to it to do exactly as he wishes.
Gavin Robertson-Dale.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will know that Northern Ireland can only benefit from power-sharing arrangements when those institutions enjoy the support and the confidence of both the nationalist and the unionist community. I think I have heard him previously accept that the Northern Ireland Protocol does not enjoy the support of any unionist in Northern Ireland. And despite references to talks having concluded in December, the Secretary of State helpfully indicated on Monday this week that further progress had been made. But does he accept that the restoration of institutions will only be secured when that confidence within the unionist community is put where it needs to be?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and indeed for the many hours of work that he personally has put into the talks that we've been having, because they are very detailed talks. It's a very complex situation. He outlines, and I have said before, because it is absolutely obvious that the Unionists in Northern Ireland are deeply unhappy with the existing Northern Ireland protocol, and I believe we have made excellent progress. And I really do hope that in the coming days and weeks we can get to a point where we can, his party can, come to a conclusion on those talks that leads us to reform the executive, because I know that he is a Democrat and wants that reformed.
Gavin Robbins.
Mr. Speaker, and the Secretary of State, I appreciate those remarks. He will have heard the concerns around the general strike which will be called tomorrow. He will know that his government dismissed our calls when we said that there simply wasn't sufficient money. He knows we had to battle for sufficient money, and he knows that he personally secured in the run-up to Christmas the availability of that money. I don't believe, Mr. Speaker, that release of the funds, which is called for by ourselves, every political party in Northern Ireland, the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and this morning 50 chief executives of public sector agencies across Northern Ireland. I don't believe that there is a lack of will on the Secretary of State's part, but this is a choice, a political choice that the government can make. So I'm asking the Secretary of State, will he use today to encourage his government colleagues, the Treasury and anyone else who believes using public sector workers as blackmail or as political pawns is in any way beneficial?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his question and indeed the way that he has put it. But as I mentioned earlier, public sector pay is devolved, and this is properly a matter for locally elected politicians who are best placed to take decisions in this space.
We come to Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 2, please.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the absence of the executive, this government has made up to £15 million of support available for businesses and non-domestic properties through the reallocation of existing funding. It is for the Northern Ireland Civil Service and local councils to consider how to utilise the remaining funds to provide further support to businesses and non-domestic properties.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you. Building resilience for the future is absolutely vital if this government are going to address the challenges around climate change. York's resilience measures cost over £100 million to protect my city this winter, and the estimated cost to Neary alone, just to businesses, was £37 million as a result of this winter weather. So when will the Minister bring forward a proper amount of money, not just 15 million, maybe a deposit, but a proper amount to ensure that Northern Ireland can build its resilience for the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd answer in a couple of ways. The first thing to say is that at the moment only just over £1 million of that 15 million has been drawn down, which is a sign that it is sufficient. The second point I'd made is that the Northern Ireland Civil Service has recently announced that up to £10 million is now being made available, which will be targeted at assisting small and medium-sized businesses. Up to £100,000 per business will be available. And I think the experience of our own constituency, and I do have those figures in front of me, it does show that this government is committed to being ready for the future on infrastructure. That's partly why we're so keen to see the executive back with a large package to help support the stabilisation and the transformation of public services, so we can get just the kind of investment she refers to.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll answer questions 3, 10 and 12 together. The Government has taken decisive action to help tackle increases in the cost of living, including support for the most vulnerable households in Northern Ireland. We are targeting support this winter through a range of support, including £900 cost of living payments. It remains vital that there is a functioning executive in place that can deliver for the people of Northern Ireland, who deserve that stable government taking the relevant decisions.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to return to public sector pay, because public sector workers in Northern Ireland have saw their real pay fall by more than 7% over the last year. So does this not demonstrate that the UK government's response to the cost of living crisis is leaving Northern Ireland behind, and can encourage them to join the cross-party calls to ensure that public sector workers in Northern Ireland are fairly paid for their important work?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful that he raises this again, and he will have heard what my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, said. But I do want to emphasise that the sum of money which has been made available in what is a large package for stabilisation and transformation in Northern Ireland does include a sum of money to enable public sector pay to be settled, but that is a matter to be decided in Northern Ireland, and that is why we continue to press with as much force as we can muster to ask the DUP and other parties to restore the Assembly and the Executive to deal with this.
Mr. Speaker, given that the UK is experiencing the biggest drop in living standards on record, with households bearing the brunt of higher energy costs, and temperatures dropping dramatically this week across Northern Ireland and indeed Scotland, why has the UK government left households out in the cold this winter?
Mr. Speaker, I don't accept that we've left households in the cold. A further cost of living support through the winter period for Northern Ireland households was announced in the autumn statement in 22, with additional payments to households across the UK on means-tested benefits getting £900, on disability benefits £150, and pensioner households £300. We're absolutely resolved to promote prosperity in Northern Ireland, and we are seized of the reality that disposable incomes in Northern Ireland are particularly squeezed, and that's why we've put in a range of measures to promote prosperity, which I hope to return to in later answers.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've just heard the Minister say that incomes in Northern Ireland are particularly squeezed. In November, the typical monthly pay in Northern Ireland saw a month-on-month fall of 1.8%. By contrast, typical wages in the UK showed a 1.2% month-on-month increase. That means that earnings in Northern Ireland sat 11% below UK earnings. That's the biggest difference on record. So what steps are being taken now, in the absence of a functioning Stormont, to offer some kind of sustainable pay deal in Northern Ireland for public sector workers?
Mr. Speaker, I could give a lengthy answer to her question which would try your patience, but I just would return to her final question: what is being done for public sector workers? We are absolutely seized, as we've said before, of the need to ensure public sector workers have a pay rise, and that is why a very substantial sum is in the package on the table for the parties. But we're absolutely clear that on this issue, as across a wide field, as I'm sure we'll hear in the course of questions, Northern Ireland needs devolved government to take the relevant decisions in Northern Ireland. And on that, there's consensus across the House.
Liz.
The government's package to support people with the cost of living amounts to about 94 billion over 2 years. It's one of the most comprehensive in Europe. can he assure the House that people in Northern Ireland have had full access to those cost of living support measures as an integral part of our United Kingdom?
Speaker, she's absolutely right. And I think I should just say that the extent of government support to Northern Ireland households was unprecedented and included the energy price guarantee on electricity and gas bills, £600 in payments comprising £400 for energy bill support scheme payments, plus £200 to recognise the widespread use of home heating oil, and targeted support for the most vulnerable households, some of which I already touched on. She's absolutely right that we are determined to ensure that Northern Ireland feels the benefits of being in this union of this United Kingdom.
Shadow Minister Florence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently I met with the Melted Parents campaign group in Belfast. They speak for so many parents across Northern Ireland where the cost of living crisis is far harder for families because there is no funding for a free childcare scheme, no 15 or 30 preschool hours, just eye-watering and unaffordable bills. But there is a cross-party childcare strategy proposal. So can the Minister say now to all the employers and parents watching, if there is a new temporary budget for Northern Ireland, will it include childcare funding provision?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful that the Honourable Lady has raised this issue. It is of the highest importance in Northern Ireland, and it's an issue impressed upon me frequently. The budget, of course, will be debated in this House, and I'm confident we'll return to it. But I think, once again, as we've said before, this is one of those issues which once again underscores the importance of a returning executive, and I'm grateful that we agree on that point. She's absolutely right to raise this issue.
Martin Dobson-Hughes.
Well done. Thanks very much. Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Like the member for West Dunbartonshire, I'm quite surprised he was that popular too. So, I'm sorry. I misread the room again, Mr. Speaker. The Troubles Payment Disablement Payments. The Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme is a devolved matter delivered by the Victims Payments Board, and I met with Judge McAlinden, the President of the Board, last week to discuss these matters.
Mr. Speaker, according to the recent evidence presented to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, and this is actually very serious, it's not a joke, it could take more, maybe members might want to listen, it could take more than 10 years to process the applications for Troubles Victims Compensation Scheme, meaning victims in Northern Ireland who have waited decades for compensation to be delivered will need to wait even longer. Can the Secretary of State advise not only the House but those awaiting payment what he's doing, his government doing, to deliver that compensation scheme?
Yeah, as I said, I'm actually conducting a review, and having met Judge McAlinden, conducting a review on the operation of the scheme that will report before August this year. The review's underway, and I very much hope that it will address all the matters, so those that actually do qualify for these payments get them in a much more expedited way.
Spokesperson Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given the length of time it takes in many cases to gather the supporting evidence to make a claim under the scheme, given the pressures on the Payments Board itself, and the very strong likelihood that many of those who are potentially eligible have yet to apply, it's clear that there's a risk that many of those who could be eligible for a payment may miss out as things stand. So one of the ways that the Minister, the Secretary of State, could mitigate against that is to extend the period that is allowed for claims to be made and processed. As part of this review, will he consider extending that deadline?
Yes, it is actually part of the review. It's one of the questions we're looking at.
Simon Benn.
Question number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
I wish to reassure I thank my honourable friend for his question. I wish to reassure him that the UK government is fully committed to protecting and upholding Northern Ireland's place in the Union. I regularly discuss matters of Union and the importance of Northern Ireland within it and with Cabinet colleagues, and meet frequently with the Secretary of State for Wales and Scotland.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the Union is now stronger than ever, particularly with the decline of the SNP, and that its vital importance can be seen not only in Northern Ireland, but also in border constituencies like mine of Clwyd South, particularly in shared services across the border with neighbouring North Shropshire, such as the Gabowen to Wrexham line, the A5A483 and the Church St Martin's GP partnership?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you can see, all politics is local, and I congratulate my honourable friend in the success of shared cross-border services in his constituency, and he's absolutely right. I know he's a great champion of connectivity across the United Kingdom, and I'm sure his constituents appreciate his efforts on these matters.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, every devious, deceitful and dishonest tactic is being used to try and bribe, bully and beat Unionists into accepting the Windsor Framework and the Northern Ireland Protocol, despite the impact it has on our citizenship and on the Union. It seems that the latest recruit is the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, who only this week has told BBC that Unionists should get back into Stormont because constitutional issues are the responsibility of the EU, and that the Irish government in any settlement would have a say in the future of Northern Ireland. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this Conservative Unionist government has not handed constitutional control of Northern Ireland to the EU, and that the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee has either become an overzealous advocate of the scare tactics or is talking through his hat?
And see, you're as brief as ever, Secretary of State.
Well, based on that, Chair, the Select Committee Chair has a lot of work to do to increase his popularity in this House. I think, as ever, the honourable gentleman asks a question in his characteristic shrinking violet way, and I have to say I completely disagree with what he says about my right honourable friend. But we need to get a deal done now. The people of Northern Ireland want to get a deal done. It is time for a deal to be done. Let's get the executive back up and running.
Before we come to Prime Minister